Welcome to using third-party JavaScript libraries with Lightning components. I'm William Ye, Senior Product Manager here at Salesforce on the Lightning platform. Specifically, I own the instrumentation. So if you have any interest or thoughts on what would be interesting data to look at on the Lightning site, feel free to come reach out to me and chat after the session. The session I'm presenting today is on third-party JS, and that's because last year I was still a tech evangelist here at Salesforce. So we cover a little bit more around the whole technology space and different ways you can build on the platform. One interesting thing is normally this session would be the earlier one, since it's kind of set the preface for you to learn more deeper technology on each session. Today it's on the second one, but I think all of the sessions on DX is recorded, so feel free to go back and check them out for any specific area you might be more interested in. So to get started, of course, we need to go through our forward-looking statement. By now, you probably have seen it 5, 6, or more times. But bear with me. We are a publicly traded company, so we do ask you to make any and all of your purchasing decisions based on what's currently available. So here's our agenda today. We'll start with what is LockerService. Now, how many of you here have heard of LockerService? Great, most of you. And I wouldn't be surprised because we've been talking about this over a long time, since last year or even further earlier. But now we're at a pretty mature state. And I think it's important for you guys to understand, first of all, why we built it, what does it really do, and how will it affect you on using JavaScript on the platform. Then we'll talk a little bit about getting started with using the JavaScript on Lightning component itself, as well as a little bit on the Lightning framework. And the reason I put that in here is because Lightning framework itself offers a lot of things that you might be looking for from other JavaScript libraries. And if you use something that's on platform, it will save you effort and make it easier for you to build versus having to go through the hoops to make sure that everything works properly. And lastly, I'll talk about what happens if you just can't get it to work, but you really need that library. Well, we got the brand new Lightning container component to help, and we'll go into more details on that. We will have some time in the end for Q&A, so please save your questions till then. So let's get started. What is LockerService? So as the great Uncle Ben in Spider-Man once said, with great power comes great responsibility. With Lightning, Salesforce opened up the platform even further. We give our developers more power in terms of building our own Lightning components that you can insert into your environment within the DOM. So this is no longer segmented by our iframe. It's within the same page. This gives you more power because you can leverage features like Lightning Data Service to access the data within the cache. You can make inter-component communication more easily without having to jump through the framing restrictions. But at the same time, that brings up some problems. As you all know, modern-day browsers, they're not really designed for these kind of multi-tenant component development. So when you have all these components within the same page, we might have some security risk. And as you all know, trust is Salesforce's #1 value. And we have to make sure that our platform is trusted to give our customers a peace of mind. So here's some of the key things that Locker help prevents on Lightning. It protects some of the cross-site scripting security issues, which is really important since you're building all these components next to each other. And of course, we're preventing components from reading render data or accessing the window and DOM object without restrictions. So what that means is today, if a rogue developer wants to create a component to consume other component data within the UI, they won't be able to do that. Because without that kind of safety net, it's really easy for them to hop between components. And of course, we restrict calling on undocumented and private APIs. That's just another security measure as well. So here's a quick list of third-party libraries, the more common ones that we know of. Green is functional. Yellow is partial or mod required, and red is just probably won't work. Now, one thing to note is even if they're green, that doesn't guarantee they will work 100%. There might still be areas and kinks or sub-features that might not work properly. So you do need to go through the test. We have the CLI tool that will allow you to run your Lightning components through to test and make sure that you won't hit any major issues. But even with the CLI tool, that's not bulletproof. You might still have certain UI level things that you need to work out. And it's important to note on the yellow side, what we mean by modding is we do see some developers tend to go into the libraries they are using and mod them. But I want to remind you that it is a lot of work that you're building up, because let's say you modify 1.2 version of such and such library. Once they release a new version, you have to go back and change them. And you don't always know what the dependency would be like. Maybe they do some major updates to their library, which will make it a lot difficult for you to support them in the future. So it's important to think about that as well. Okay, so on a high level, here's the rollout plan for Locker. So summer 17 is already out, which is our API version 40. It's very important to know that number because we're no longer using the critical update on LockerService. So previously, if you tested around Lightning components, you would have the critical update setting within your org that can toggle on and off to turn on and off LockerService. Now it's very different now. We will open the LockerService itself. So if you build a component before version 40, then they won't be affected by LockerService. But if your component is beyond version 40, then LockerService will be enforced upon it. Now, one important thing to note is if you do need to test without LockerService, say you're just prototyping it, you want to first see what it looks like and then fix out the kinks, you could lower your API version to below 40 and LockerService won't be enforced. Actually, how many of you have built a Lightning component so far? Oh, nice. So make sure you go check that out. Test your component between the two. And then you still have some buffer time, but we are helping our customers to move forward to the newer API, of course, since that's where all the new stuff are. One key thing to note is with Winter 18, CSP was enforced. So again, the CLI tool I mentioned, make sure you use that to test your Lightning component because it will test against both LockerService and CSP. Lastly, just a side note, we are extending our support for I11 till 2020. So I know a lot of customers, especially the industry that's taking a longer time to update their IT, they might want that. But with I11, you won't get LockerService and CSP. So we are actively moving customers to the newer standard. So with that, let me show you quickly a Lightning component we have using third-party JavaScript within the org. So this is actually a demo I given last year at Dreamforce. It's a little org chart on the left, but what I want you guys to focus on is the map component here on the right. So as you know, we have the limit on unsupported APIs and public APIs. So we're not letting components making direct callouts. In this case, Leaflet.js actually fulfills the need here. Leaflets allow you to have your JS locally, and that's how you're rendering the map here. So the component itself is wired up to listen to events from the other components. When I click on another user, it will go into the map of that another user. I think I'm having some Wi-Fi issues here, but shouldn't be a problem. So to get started, of course, you need to get your library into your org. So how many of you guys have built Visualforce pages before? Great, so a little over half. Then you guys should be pretty familiar with static resources, right? Static resources is where you can upload your content onto it. So in this case, I have a leaflet item. This is a zip file I packed up. I highly recommend you guys to do it in zip files because if you upload independent JavaScript and CSS, then it'll just be harder for you to maintain it. You need to go update each and every one of them. Even though you're uploading as a zip file structure, when you develop, you can access the subfolder content in there. So that's not a worry. So let me dive into my developer console just to show you guys a little bit what it looks like. So here we have my map component. I'm setting out a lot of attributes. Pretty standard stuff, but the important thing is here, there's 2 lines of LTNG require. So this is where you will be including your static resources, which is your libraries. One very important thing to note is that these static resources are loaded in sequential order. Meaning if you have multiple JavaScript libraries or JS that you wrote that has dependency, you want to make sure you do them in the right order. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to find the references. After your script is loaded, you can actually call a after script loaded function. This will execute whichever initialization you might have to get things started. So in this case, I have one called JS loaded. Let me go into my controller. So JS loaded, it's pretty straightforward. As you'll know, the map component listens to other component events and show you the most updated address of that location. So we're actually assigning the record ID in this case, and then we'll call our helper to generate the map. Now within the map, it's pretty easy as well since we got Leaflet to take care of most of the stuff. Essentially, we're checking if there's a map already, and then we will initialize the map and call into that location. And then the location right now is this DOM called map, which we have on our main component. So if I scroll down here, I can show you guys. There you go. So that's just a div that we're updating to put the map in. Pretty easy, straightforward, right? So that's the beginning of getting things started. In a happy world, include your library and call it, and it should work. But of course, with LockerService, things are a little different. That's why we have our own Lightning framework as well. So this is, if you take one thing out of this session, I know container component is very interesting, but actually I would like you to think about this. Consider using Lightning framework first. And the reason of that is, there's a lot of libraries you're using, whether it's jQuery or some other more complex ones. In jQuery's term, sometimes people are considering it as an anti-pattern now because of its excessive access of window DOMs. With Lightning Framework, we actually have all the similar features built in as well that will make it easier for life. I'll show you an example in a bit. But really, sometimes certain functionalities of your library just won't work properly. And that's totally acceptable. We have different options around it. So I'll go into that in the detail in a bit, but really it's about testing your libraries, making sure you know what works, what doesn't, and if it doesn't, check out Lightning Framework first, because likely we'll have some things there for you to fill the gap. And RDocs is a great resource to use in this case, because it actually shows you all the APIs within your org specifically. So if a custom component you installed has certain events, that will be listed within your RDocs as well, and that's how you know how to work within these pieces. And whenever we add new components or events or JS, that will surface within the RDocs as well. Base components will be another good friend of yours. So this one is less about the libraries, but just more about saving you time. Traditionally, when you create a component, first you add the markup, then you need to apply, SLDS or other styling, and then you hook up the JavaScript to it. With base components, this saves your effort. All you need to do is to call the markup, Lightning input, Lightning select, and we take care of that wiring for you. You have a button right away, you have a dropdown right away, styled and working functionally. We even have additional attributes in there, so you can set, for example, for a field, you can set, what's the maximum value for that. So what better way would it be than to kind of show you in person what we're talking about? So back to this same org then. Let me switch back to my tab. Actually, before that, let me show you a screen real quick. So have you guys seen a window like this similarly recently? Yep. So yeah, as you know, since you're working with JavaScript, often you might get errors. This error actually happened to the exact component I showed you earlier that we set up. And the problem was that the map container is already initialized. So sometimes when you're running in that org and you switch between tabs to the map one and to some other home tab or record tab, When you switch back, it gives you this error. And you might wonder, what happened? Why are we seeing this initialization problem? Well, that's the locker service enforcement, right? I talked about how we're enforcing your DOM so you can't just access window object like that. So in our use case here, once you go into the leaflet and jump back and forth, even though you're going to another tab, we're not removing it entirely. In Lightning, we're just hiding that behind the view. And so when you go back, you can access it right away. However, notice right now I don't have that issue. That's because summer release just came out, and this component was within API 37, which is under 40. So I'm not hitting that issue right now, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? It's still there. We're still accessing the window, which we shouldn't be. So how should we go about it? Well, I happen to know a pretty good place to look for an alternative. So sometimes it takes a little bit for it to load, and that's because we're pulling the live reference within the org. So in this org, we have our standard JavaScript API from the Lightning framework. And I happen to know that under a component, there's another way to find an object that's not just calling the standard DOM. So in this case, we have component.find, which takes you to a RID. So it's not a standard ID, but this gives you the access to the component itself. So this is what we'll be using to help solve our little issue here with the map. So remember how we were just in the helper earlier? And then I mentioned that this is how we're updating the map. We're looking at the DOM, finding the div, and then replacing that. So instead of using just the DOM, we will use component.find instead. So in this case, component.find, and then let's call it rmap. Let's see, and then we do need to get the element because, as I mentioned from the doc itself, when you use the component.find, it's looking for the component, but not the element itself. So you actually need to go one level deeper to do so. And of course, we need to go back to our map itself to make sure that we're adding the RID. And notice I have a comment here because it's kind of hard to find in the web of divs. Great, so in that case, we kind of passed the issue using the component.find. I think it's a better way to do so. And of course, we can update our bundle version. So this is where you change your API. If you have a 40 that doesn't work in LockerService, you can downgrade it here, and vice versa. Save it, and that's it. If I go back to my component and reload, it should still work as is without any hiccup. Great, so pretty easy, right? Just go and look into the different features we have within Lightning Framework. I believe we have a session on that as well, and we have a separate session on LockerService specifically. So if you're interested in more about how we're enforcing the security on that side, it will be a good session for you to go to. Before we head back to the slides and go into the more interesting stuff, I just want to quickly show you guys the base component as well. So let me create a new page here and add a component to show you guys what I mean by leveraging the base components. So in this case, let me find an interesting one. Offer letter SPA. This should be good. Any one of you guys saw the theater session yesterday on recruitment app? No? OK, that's fine. So let me quickly show you guys this little component that my previous team has built. So this is a Lightning component we built within a recruitment application. So imagine when you interviewed a candidate, you went through the process, and you're ready to send them an offer letter. Now, what better way would it be to, oops, I didn't activate it, than to just show them, an easy way to fill in the salary and everything together. So let me activate my field here. Nice. Bear with me because I have a little VPN here, which makes it a lot slower. Huh? Why isn't it coming up? Okay, that's fine. I'll just talk through it within the setup page here. So this is a send offer Lightning component we built. Let me zoom in, or zoom out, I mean. So in this case, it's so small, but we have a field that says salary, a field with bonus, and then offer letter. All these fields are created with base component, meaning all I did was one tag, and that's it. So in this case, I can show you within my dev console what it looks like. So in the dev console, this is the view of that detail page. All I have is one tag, really, Lightning input. I give it a name, tell the type. You can even format it to currency. So in this case, it will have the proper decimal place. And the cool thing here is you can actually set minimum and maximum value. So all these things are wired up for you. You don't even need to recreate it yourself. All you need to do is to add a tag in there, and that's done. Similar for dropdown, you can have an optional value to say choose now, and then you can actually pull the records to see real time what different template ID you have for the email, and then drop it in there. So this one is just something quick I want to show you guys. But let me get back to the main topic. So the backup plan. Let's see, we went through the Locker service. We showed you how to start with your JavaScript library. You test it out, and you realize, hey, I just can't get it to work. And what should I do now? Some of you guys might have tried the Visualforce and iframe approach. Anyone tried iframing Visualforce? Yeah? So yeah, we got maybe like 10 guys here. So it's pre-2016. I mean, personally, I did recommend you guys to do this last year at Dreamforce as well. And I did mention a lot containers coming. But the great news is containers here. So you no longer need to wait. If you went through the Visualforce approach, I mean, it still works. Nothing's going to change. But you do know that you have to do the post message for every interaction. It is quite a lot of overhead as you build further. The good thing with container is we solved that for you. So Lightning container component, currently in developer preview. It's pretty easy to get started. The best part is you can develop it locally. So previously in the Visualforce iframe approach, you make your Visualforce page, then you iframe in there. With container component, we'll give you the ability to upload your local files, kind of like how you're doing the static resources, but this time you're doing your whole HTML page with your CSS and JS. So you can really use any IDE you like, whether it's Visual Studio, Atom, Maven. Once you finish creating that page, you can still reference Apex controller as well, because Lightning Container Component actually gives you a full session IDE. Once you get everything developed, zipped it up, upload it, and the page will serve within your Lightning component, just like the Visualforce approach. But the best part is we take care of the message channel for you, so you don't need to deal with the back and forth post message between your component and your page. So the Lightning Container Component itself, a little wordy, we usually call it the LCC, uses the native isolation mechanism. It's pretty much a fancier way of saying iframe. So the page you're serving into it is still iframe in there. So that means it will support any library because it's not enforced by our Locker service. But at the same time, there is a cost, which is there's still some iframe limitations around it. For example, some scrolling issues or not remembering the state. And lastly, since it's an iframe, every time you serve it, it loads the libraries and its CSS again. So it can be quite taxing and not efficient if you have multiple of them. I think for LCC, the best type of app to build is those single-page apps that you can run independently, that you really need a framework to run for you, then that would be a good fit. Otherwise, go native on component, use our framework. And again, you don't need to deal with post message. That was kind of like the biggest ask I keep hearing from everyone is, okay, I got a Visualforce page, and No, I need to build every time to receive different message. Yep, you do. So let me go into my org here to show you what it kind of looks like. So here's a Realty app. This is a Realtor application which keeps track of contacts and properties. In this case, you see I have a component here that grabs all my properties available. I can click into it to see the details, see the pictures, go to my contacts. I can even follow records properly. You see all pretty fluid, pretty quick, and getting all the data just like you're expecting. But this whole thing is actually done within container component. So you might ask, you're developing this locally, how are you accessing that? Well, it's actually pretty cool how we got all these set up. So I'm just going to show you the service since we only have limited time. To get started, of course, you can check out this GitHub. We actually have a GitHub set up by the developers who created this sample component. I have the link in the deck, so after the session, you guys can check that out and git clone it. It's a React app. Using the libraries included from Lightning Container Component, you can actually pretty easily install this because we use npm and Webpack. So typical web development stuff, nothing too crazy or new. But if I go into the classes itself, you can first see the broker service. So let me go into my property service. Here we go. So remember the property page I showed you guys with a list of different properties? Over here first, of course, we need to do some field mapping because that's how you would get the right data in. But let me scroll down and show you guys something cool here. See anything familiar here? It's SQL queries. So even though I'm developing this whole web app locally, gonna build it later, I can actually write SQL queries to access data. And that's my nature, right? Because we're not building native components, so you don't get to use the nice data service. But we still want to give you access to data, because without data and Salesforce, it's not really valuable components. So you can actually write SQL queries to build them up, access records, update them, insert them. Now you might ask, how am I wiring this up? So let me go into my H file. So there's two key things we're importing here. The LCC, which is given from the Lightning container, and also the data service. That's how we're hooking up the instance and querying and updating data. So if you look at the service here, we're actually creating a brand new instance using an access token from LCC. So with LCC, you do get an API session token. That's how you'll be able to call Apex classes or even just make direct query updates. Pretty awesome, right? And so say I got everything here written up, packed up, build it. Next, I have a zip file. And all you do is very similar to how you get started here. We go into our static resources. We upload our zip file within it. One thing to note is static resources do have a file limit. So only include what you need. I think that's the recommendation. And then if we go into my dev console here, here's my realty component. Really all that is this little section here. Lightning container, you will reference the source, which is your zip file. Access the subfolder, call your index.html, and you can even do a message here. So this is how you tell the container what function will be handling your message back and forth. And so you have a handle message here within your controller, which will take care of the data interaction between the two. Cool. So that's a pretty quick demo. Feel free to check out the GitHub yourself and play around with it. I think it will be a really interesting way to build. But let me kind of go through what we went through today. So LockerService, again, plan ahead. CSP is coming, but at least now you have the ability to control your API version. to see how you're exposing your component. If it doesn't work entirely in Locker, you can downgrade it, but do plan ahead because you know your customer will need those Locker service on. So there's no point building a component in the past if you can't move it forward. But really the most important part is think about framework first. Because we got all these nice features built in for you, the components, the events, the services. You should just leverage it without having to jump through all these other hoops to use your container or Visualforce pages. And of course, lastly, container is here for you. Just remember that it's less efficient by nature because you're loading the iframe every time. It is a good way to do for those bigger apps, but you gotta think of a trade-off, because when you build big apps, you kind of lose the ability to give your admins the capability to reorganize a page or plug pieces in as they want. So I got some resources here available that you guys can check out. I think there's a LockerService session yesterday, so there's probably a recording as well that you guys can review if you need more information on that. And with that, we'll open up for some Q&A. Yes? Do you know timing on Lightning containers? When will be beta or GA? So the question is on the Lightning container, when we're looking at beta or GA. I don't think we have a full set yet. I think by Dreamforce, you'll have a better idea. Right now, we're still gathering developer kind of first use feedback and see how that goes. Yeah. Yes? Mm-hmm.
Or will it support the user interface API?
Could you repeat that?
Will that data service support the user interface API?
OK, so the question is whether or not the data service will support the user interface API. I don't think so, because that's under the metadata side. So really, it's giving a REST service that you can call into object records and so on, or controller within the org. Yes? That's a simple React app.
Have you guys tried to implement that with routing and also state management?
I believe so. So that project I just showed you is still in development. It's a very early port. So the Realty app was actually originally just a standard Lightning app we have, and then they ported over to the container side. So it used to be just like a Visualforce page thing. Mm-hmm.
Is that, would you consider using a protector component at that point? Because for some odd reason, it's not rendering.
Let's take it offline, yeah.
How is the Lightning container calculating its height? Because it's an iframe. How is it communicating, or what is it? How is it working under the hood?
Yeah, so when the container, the question is how are we calculating the height and width? So when the container is loaded, you actually have the initial size. The only problem is resizing, because no, it's not, because that's the iframe limit. So then you have to handle, by yourself on the response, which is difficult. That's why I mentioned, there's still the iframe limitation. That's the nature of it. So it's not good for creating small component that you're moving around on the page a lot. But if it's a single page app that's usually broadened up, then you won't have that issue as much. Yes? Mm-hmm. OK, so the question is on the scrolling issue, but that's pretty much just when you iframe a page inside another page, often you kind of lose the scrolling context. Right, so if you render the page that's smaller, and then you scroll on the outer layer, it wouldn't scroll the content in there. Yeah, so then you have to ship it right. But I mean, there's some edge cases when a user resized it, and now everything's kind of weirded up. So it's more of a usability thing than functionality, really. Mm-hmm. That one might be better to talk about with the dev evangelist. I haven't done as much on that side. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
Would you guys ever support
So right now we're still just looking at the foundation side. We don't do specific, support on certain development side. I think that's, you probably can get more from the Locker service talk than from me.
And there is no caching at all made by Salesforce on the LCC. I mean, it's an item, and Salesforce has the source code, so it knows when it changes. So currently there is no caching at all on the broker side. Or is there?
Not that I know of, but I'm probably not the best person to talk about that in detail. Yeah.
This is more related to the productions because we have less problems with the caching in the sandbox.
Yeah. Well, we can talk about it afterwards. Cool. Well, thanks for coming.